The night had a strange stillness, the kind that settles before a storm changes the direction of a family's destiny. The mansion stood in silent darkness at 2 a.m., its glass windows reflecting the moonlight like watchful eyes. Inside, the air carried the remnants of a lavish corporate dinner that had ended only an hour earlier. The silver cutlery still rested on the long marble dining table, wine glasses half empty, and perfume scents lingered like whispers of the elite who had filled the house only hours ago. It had been an evening meant to strengthen business alliances, display loyalty, and impress the most influential woman in my husband's company, Ava Kingsley, the CEO who had built an empire on property development and public image. My husband Ethan had always admired her. He spoke of her as though she was a visionary beyond ordinary comprehension, someone who turned concrete into gold. I had sensed his fascination long before that night, but I never allowed myself to assume the worst. Trust was the glue of marriage, I believed, until trust turned into the blindfold that hid the knife approaching behind me. The dinner had been extravagant, planned for weeks, with arrangements meticulously handled to meet Ava's impossible standards. She viewed luxury not as comfort, but as proof of superiority. The custom white flowers, the imported champagne, the Italian cutlery, everything existed to serve her ego. And she walked through my home like she owned it. The staff followed her silently, adjusting anything she glanced at, terrified of failing her. There was a subtle competition at the table who could flatter her more, who could gain even a second of her approval. She thrived on that power. But the true confrontation happened after the guests left. At 2 a.m., the house was supposed to rest. Yet I sensed movement, a presence that didn't belong. While walking past the glass corridor near the indoor pool, I noticed shadows and a faint echo of voices. Curiosity guided me closer, stepping softly on the marble floor. I reached the corner and saw them, Ava and my husband standing far too close for a conversation between a CEO and her employee. Her hand rested on his shoulder with a sense of ownership that no professional boundary could justify. Her stance was relaxed, confident, and territorial, as if she was claiming something that didn't belong to her. My heart didn't break at that moment, it froze, observing, absorbing, learning. Pain came later. First came awareness. Ava tilted her head with a smile that wasn't warmth, but triumph. A smile of someone used to taking what she desired, convinced the world owed her everything. And in that posture, in that unguarded moment, her true nature showed. She wasn't just a powerful woman. She was a conqueror who fed on control. I left silently without being seen. It wasn't fear that stopped me from confronting them, it was clarity. Confrontation would serve their narrative, not mine. If betrayal existed, it needed to be exposed, not argued over. I returned to the master bedroom, and the contrast of that quiet space felt suffocating. The designer furniture, the dim golden lights, the soft bedding, all once comforting, now felt like props in a theater of deception. Lying awake, I reflected on every moment leading up to this night. Small comments Ethan had made, subtle changes in his behavior, his increasing absence from home, all pieces of a puzzle that finally aligned. Yet the most shocking part wasn't Ethan's loyalty shifting, it was Ava's audacity. She didn't see me as competition. She saw me as irrelevant. That disrespect was more powerful than any betrayal. Morning arrived with forced normalcy. The staff moved around the kitchen preparing breakfast for a home that no longer felt like mine. Ethan entered casually, speaking of work and upcoming meetings, as if last night had been a dream. But there was a shift in his energy, a restlessness, almost a guilt he was trying to disguise under routine. He avoided eye contact for too long, which told me more than any confession ever could. Ava's influence seeped into our life like poison disguised as perfume. Invitations increased to charity galas, corporate retreats, private business parties, and Ethan always claimed it was good for his career if we attended. But every event was built around her world, her rules, her spotlight. Couples weren't invited. Alliances were. Whispers began reaching me from corners of the social circle. Women who had encountered Ava before knew her pattern. She did not build careers, she collected people. She chose individuals, shaped them, owned them, and once they were dependent, she discarded them to maintain her throne. Her empire wasn't built on business brilliance alone, it was built on psychological dominance. Yet, Ava underestimated one thing about me. I wasn't naive, and I wasn't helpless. Silence wasn't weakness, it was observation. I watched, I learned, and I prepared. I understood that a direct confrontation would only feed her ego. People like Ava didn't fear anger, they feared exposure. Their legacy depended on carefully crafted narratives. Remove the mask, and everything crumbled. I began studying her. The company she owned, the investments she made, the charities she funded, the partnerships she nurtured, every brick of her empire. She had a flawless public image, beloved by the media as a self-made real estate queen who empowered women in business. Her brand was built on inspiration and perfection. But perfection is often a curtain hiding rot. It was during one of her exclusive board member gatherings that I saw the first crack. The event was hosted in a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, a view designed to remind everyone of her superiority. While moving through the crowd, I noticed subtle tension among two board members. Their polite smiles were strained, and their conversations ended abruptly when certain topics were brought up. A few offhand remarks hinted at financial irregularities in one of Ava's projects, nothing public, nothing confirmed, but enough to sense a storm brewing beneath her polished surface. When Ava arrived at the event with Ethan beside her, she placed her hand lightly on his arm, an action too intimate to be innocent, yet subtle enough to be dismissed by anyone who chose not to see. The room watched, some noticed, some pretended not to. But eyes whispered. And in elite circles, whispers spread faster than scandals. I made no scene. I greeted her gracefully, thanked her for hosting, and left early with information instead of humiliation. Revenge wasn't emotional for me anymore, it was strategic. Ava was a woman who thrived on winning, so the only way to destroy her legacy was to make her lose at the game she believed she had already won. That night, back home, I outlined everything in a journal, not of pain, but of leverage. To defeat someone like her, I needed three things: motive, evidence, and timing. She had already given me motive. Evidence would come soon, and timing would be everything. But the moment that sealed the path of no return came a week later. Most people imagine life-changing confrontations happen in heated arguments, tears, or breaking points. But mine happened in quietness. At exactly 2 a.m. again, footsteps sounded down the hallway. I stepped out of the bedroom, following the faint glow from the living room. There was Ethan, sitting in the dark, staring at his phone with a look of conflict and self-hatred. He didn't see me. On his screen was a message from Ava, not romantic, but possessive, marked with entitlement. In that moment, I understood the full truth. She hadn't just targeted my marriage, she wanted control of Ethan's identity, career, and loyalty. She wanted to rewrite his life so that he existed under her shadow. Not love, ownership. I returned to bed, but this time something inside me shifted permanently. Betrayal no longer hurt. It clarified. I wasn't going to save my marriage, I was going to save myself, and in the process, and the legacy of the woman who believed she owned everything she touched. The days that followed unfolded with a deceptive calm, the kind that hides the movement of shifting tectonic plates beneath the surface. I moved through the routines of life with a composed exterior, allowing the world to believe nothing had changed. Ethan continued to behave as if he was balancing two separate identities, drifting between guilt and loyalty yet unable to detach from the gravitational pull of Ava's influence. There were moments he appeared distant, moments he tried to compensate with artificial warmth, and moments he was cold enough for the truth to reflect clearly through him. I observed it all without reaction. Silence became my shield and my strategy. My silence unsettled him more than confrontation ever would. People expect outrage when they betray. Instead, I gave him indifference. And indifference made him nervous, questioning what I may have known or felt. He sought validation from me, but I wasn't too willing to offer emotional refuge to a man willingly drifting into someone else's orbit. I allowed him to exist in his confusion while I prepared to dismantle the world he was being pulled into. Every empire falls from within, not from outside attacks. If I wanted Ava's carefully constructed legacy to collapse, I needed to understand the architecture of her success so I could target its weak beams. I started studying her life and her business, not out of fascination, but with the precision of an investigator building a case. I collected information as quietly as dust settles on untouched surfaces. I read articles about her rise in the industry, financial records available to the public, old interviews where she boasted about her achievements, panel discussions where she talked about breaking barriers for women in real estate. Her narrative was consistent, polished, empowering, and admirable on the surface. But everyone who shines that brightly tends to cast a long shadow. It was in that shadow that I needed to look. The first threads of truth revealed themselves in unexpected places. Conversations whispered between women who had crossed paths with Ava before, former employees who no longer spoke about their experience publicly but showed discomfort when her name was mentioned, distant acquaintances in business circles who avoided sharing details but hinted at something darker behind her brand. Ava was known to help women rise only if their ascent served her image. She showcased mentorship as a virtue, yet most of the women she mentored disappeared from the industry soon after, with their downfall disguised as personal choices. If I wanted proof, I needed sources that weren't afraid to speak. I began reaching out discreetly to people she had left behind. Coffee shops, anonymous emails, private social media accounts created for the sole purpose of communication. Each conversation exposed pieces of a pattern. A young architect who once worked under Ava confided that Ava exploited her ideas, took credit for them publicly, and forced her to sign an NDA when she decided to resign. A project manager revealed that 2 of Ava's biggest projects had bypassed safety regulations through questionable approvals, and the cost of fines had been buried under charity donations. A former intern implied that Ava maintained influence through fear rather than leadership, using personal information and emotional manipulation to ensure loyalty. Nothing was concrete enough to destroy her yet, but it was enough to confirm she wasn't the icon the world believed her to be. While I gathered information, I also observed the shifting dynamics within my own home. Ethan was becoming increasingly defensive about work, spending more time outside, returning with a distracted mind and a guilty conscience. I could almost predict the nights he would come home later, as if his schedule had synced with Ava's personal needs rather than professional obligations. The more consumed he became by her world, the less he noticed my detachment. He failed to realize that I was no longer a participant in the marriage. I had become an observer preparing for the ending. In silence, I removed emotional vulnerabilities one by one. I distanced myself from dependence financially, mentally, and socially. I met with a lawyer to discuss quiet protection of my assets, not to file for divorce, but to prepare for the storm I intended to unleash. I consulted a financial advisor to understand the implications of any fallout involving Ethan's career. I spoke to a friend who had media connections, not to expose anything yet, but to understand how narratives were shaped when the time came. Revenge was not an impulse. It was a structure I was building brick by brick. In the midst of these calculated steps, an invitation arrived from Ava's corporate office, a gala for investors and board members, hosted to present a new luxury residential development that would redefine urban living. Ethan urged us to attend, insisting it was crucial for networking and his growth in the company. Ironically, he expected me to play the role of a supportive spouse. Unaware that the woman beside him was no longer the one he had married, she had evolved into someone he had underestimated. The night of the event, the venue glowed with architectural brilliance. The hall was designed to impress the kind of space where wealth, influence, and ego interacted like dancers on a polished stage. Chandeliers shimmered above, glasses clinked, and conversations floated in the air like trading currency. Investors admired the ambitious plans, board members flattered the leadership, and the media cameras focused on capturing Ava's flawless image. Ava appeared in an expensive custom gown, radiating confidence as she navigated the room with a regal air. People admired her not because they respected her, but because they feared losing access to her influence. That fear disguised itself as admiration, something she had normalized so well that even she believed it was loyalty. When she approached us, her presence commanded attention, and Ethan straightened unconsciously, the way someone salutes authority without thinking. The room watched, and Ava enjoyed being watched. Her attention lingered on Ethan longer than appropriate, her satisfaction barely concealed. Yet she spoke to me with the polished warmth she reserved for those she considered harmless. She still saw me as the quiet, fragile wife, the kind she believed she could easily outshine and remove if needed. It was her greatest miscalculation. Throughout the evening, I took mental notes not of her speech or the project presentation, but of the expressions exchanged in the crowd. The board members who whispered behind her back, the investor who seemed unconvinced by the projected numbers, the architect who flinched when Ava praised the design that likely wasn't hers. There were cracks, small but visible. And cracks in the foundation of a legacy are more dangerous than external attacks. As the event ended and guests began leaving, I stayed back under the pretext of appreciating the venue. That quiet moment allowed me to overhear a conversation that confirmed everything I suspected. Two investors, unaware of my presence, discussed concerns about the legality of land acquisition for Ava's new project. One mentioned a pending complaint, another hinted at falsified documents. It wasn't enough to make headlines, but enough to cause a tremor if exposed. A legacy built on deception doesn't need a hammer to collapse, it needs a spark. Returning home that night, I didn't feel anger or jealousy, I felt purpose. I understood Ava's power wasn't in her achievements, it was in people as belief in her perfection. To destroy her, I didn't need to break her. I needed to break the belief that protected her. Once the world saw her truth, her fall would be inevitable and irreversible. Ethan was asleep when I entered the bedroom. I stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The world outside continued unaware of the quiet war that had begun. But wars don't start with noise, they start with decisions made in silence. In that stillness, I made a promise to myself. I would dismantle Ava's empire with the same calm she believed reflected strength. I would take the very tools she used, reputation, influence, networks, power, and turn them against her. And when she realized the storm was mine, not hers, it would already be too late. Revenge didn't need rage, it needed patience. I wasn't seeking to win, I was preparing to end. And just like that, the foundation of my silent war was laid. The campaign to unmake a life built on myth requires patience, patience sharpened into focus. The most dangerous adversary is never the loudest. It is the one who believes themselves invulnerable. Ava's invulnerability was her arrogance, and arrogance I intended to exploit with the kind of clinical patience she thought she had taught the world. I moved with small, precise steps, each action designed to reveal the hidden scaffolding of her empire without announcing my hand. I refined my approach into 3 simultaneous operations: corroboration, containment, and exposure readiness. Corroboration meant turning scattered whispers into a coherent narrative. Containment meant protecting myself and those I cared for from collateral damage. Exposure readiness meant constructing a delivery method powerful enough to shatter public faith in her brand when the evidence was undeniable. Each operation required different resources and different confidants. I built those quietly. Corroboration began by strengthening lines of communication with those who knew Ava intimately and regretted the knowledge they carried. I found a retired legal consultant who had once been tangentially involved in one of Ava's early projects. He lived in a modest apartment, a long taxi ride from the glittering towers where Ava's name adorned the entrance. He spoke less like a disgruntled witness and more like a man who had seen the erosion of an industry by artifice. He confirmed that Ava had negotiated deals in ways that blurred ethical lines, that her charm often masked the coercion used to obtain signatures and consent. He provided leads to documents archived under different corporate names, financial footprints that, once traced, could reveal inconsistencies. Another source was a landscape architect who had left a prominent project suddenly and without public reason. Through careful, guarded conversations, she revealed how her designs had been altered to accommodate cheaper materials and shortcuts, how health and safety measures had been downplayed to increase margins, and how those corners had been hidden in rebranded expense reports. She also mentioned a pattern of NDAs and settlement offers, small sums given in exchange for silence, used strategically to keep accusations from surfacing publicly. These whisper payments built an invisible net that protected Ava's image. Nets break, but only when someone knows where to cut. Containment meant revisiting my own vulnerabilities and closing them so that when the storm hit, I would not be the first casualty. I diversified my public appearances and decoupled my social identity from Ethan's professional image. I quietly reached out to a few trusted friends in media, not to start a fire, but to learn how stories were framed and how to ensure the narrative would center on facts rather than emotion. I spoke to a private investigator about the ethics and legalities of collecting evidence. I sought advice on what constituted admissible proof versus hearsay. Everything I did was about minimizing risk and maximizing veracity. I also made practical changes at home. Financial independence had been a goal quietly pursued earlier, and now it was fortified. I ensured access to accounts and documentation, consolidated proof of ownership and inheritance, and began preparing a private portfolio of evidence linking Ava to questionable deals. The last thing I needed was for Ethan's career collapse to eliminate my resources before the truth reached the public. The hardest part of containment, though, was the personal cost. Silence can protect a plan, but silence also isolates. Friends wondered why appearances at charity events dwindled. Family asked why I seemed distant. I allowed them to ask and answered with neutral reassurances, because the less they knew, the safer they would be if the avalanche began. The emotional ledger balanced towards sacrifice, but sacrifice was a small price for the kind of justice I intended to execute. Evidence gathering required creativity and legality. I learned how public records could be stitched together, how company names and subsidiary structures could disguise money flows, and how construction permits and inspection reports often held the first markers of malpractice. I spent long hours with spreadsheets, annotating dates and cross-referencing contractors and vendors. I mapped transactions, matched phone records with public filings, and traced shell companies back to tangible people. The work was tedious, but revealing reality has a habit of leaving fingerprints if one takes the time to look. In a surprising turn, an old acquaintance of Ava's, someone who had once been part of the same social circuit and later ostracized, reached out covertly. He spoke not out of malice, but out of regret. He had watched Ava's tactics evolve and had suffered the consequences when she discarded him. He confirmed that certain properties attributed to Ava were, in part, acquired through quiet pressure on small-time owners who feared litigation or social ostracism. He offered access to a trove of emails, carefully archived personal messages that hinted at directions given to subordinate staff to smooth over issues and to donate to the right causes for PR cover-ups. Emails are tricky. Words without context are dangerous. But when matched to invoices and meeting notes, they could stitch into a convincing narrative. Each piece of information elevated the plan from suspicion to structure. I hired an accountant on retainer, someone who specialized in forensic reviews of real estate portfolios. She translated the chaotic maze of shell corporations and charitable payments into a clean, annotated report. The report showed irregularities, payments redirected to entities with opaque owners, Inflated invoices whose surplus funds were siphoned for undisclosed purposes, and a series of consulting fees paid to companies later dissolved. The accountants stressed that none of these facts alone would topple a titan, but together they created an undeniable pattern. Patterns are persuasive to investors, regulators, and journalists alike. I also found strength in quiet alliances. One of Ava's former proteges, a woman who had once been uniquely close to the CEO, offered a candid account of manipulation that read like a roadmap of psychological control. She described the nuance of being rewarded with public praise while simultaneously being isolated from colleagues, the subtle conditioning that made dependence feel like gratitude. Her story lent the human dimension to the financial and legal anomalies. It revealed motive and method in a way numbers could not. The most dangerous testimony is not the loudest. It is the one that aligns with the documents in quiet corroboration. As I compiled the dossier, I also designed the sequence of revelation. Timing mattered. Exposed too early, and Ava's influence would taint the narrative. Exposed too late, and evidence could be buried or litigated into oblivion. I planned to move only when the dossier turned from a private certainty into a public avalanche. To do that, I needed channels. A regulatory body with jurisdiction, journalists with credibility, and a legal team ready to respond to inevitable counterclaims. One evening, while arranging documents in a secure folder, Ethan found a printout spreadsheet linking an obscure vendor to a shell company. He asked about it, his curiosity thinly veiled as concern. I showed him only what I needed him to see. Facts arranged dispassionately, not accusations. His reaction was complex. There was denial, then anger, then a shadow of comprehension. He pressed for explanations, for reasons, for how I could be sure. I answered with calmness. He loved Ava because she offered him belonging and professional validation. He feared losing both. I did not argue about emotions or loyalty. I argued about truth, and truth is heavier than sentiment. Ethan's confusion became an asset. He began to distance himself from Ava subtly, not out of commitment to me, but from the dizzying realization that his esteem for her had been curated. That distance provided me space to act without being preempted, and it prevented immediate retaliation that could have frozen my plans in their tracks. He was a man caught between loyalty and reality, and his internal conflict bought me time. As the dossier grew, so did Ava's suspicions, though she remained outwardly impervious. People like her sense patterns, even when they cannot name them. She began to scrutinize her meetings more closely, to tighten the circle of those present at sensitive discussions, and to micromanage communications. The more she controlled, the more she confirmed my initial insight. Control was her currency, and she would spend any resource to protect it. Her tightening grip, however, made everyone else careless. When power becomes fragile, the need to display it often produces mistakes. An insecure ruler orders more public affirmation, and those affirmations leave evidence. When the dossier reached a point where legal teams and journalists could verify it, I pivoted to exposure readiness. I had lined up an independent regulator familiar with infrastructure oversight and a journalist known for meticulous, non-sensational investigative pieces. Both required confidentiality and the ability to verify facts quickly. I gave them a preview, a few non-consequential documents that validated the pattern without exposing our full hand. The regulator agreed to open a preliminary review if presented with clear evidence of misappropriation. The journalists signaled interest but insisted on airtight sourcing. The legal counsel prepared for immediate pushback, cease and desist letters, defamation threats, and the possibility of litigation intended to silence rather than seek truth. In private, as the wheels turned, I questioned my motives more times than I expected. Revenge is a double-edged blade. The satisfaction of seeing an unjust woman fall can be complicated by the collateral loss of relationships and former comforts. But the memory of that night at 2 a.m., when ownership was declared like a claim on a human being, turned each hesitation into resolve. This was not vindictiveness for its own sake. It was a dismantling of a system that allowed the powerful to exploit the powerless. The final days before we decided to move were the most tense. Small events seemed deliberately orchestrated by fate, a board member suddenly deciding to resign, a contractor filing a late complaint, a whistleblower amplifying concerns in a private forum. These were not coincidences. They were triggers we had prepared for. My team, composed of legal minds, forensic accountants, and discreet journalists, synchronized their clocks. There was a quiet exhilaration in the air, not unlike the calm before a crucial trial. On the night before the disclosure, I walked alone through the house, touching the surfaces that had once symbolized comfort. Each object now felt like evidence of a life I was rewriting. In the study, I looked at framed photos of philanthropic events where we had stood smiling beside Ava, at awards ceremonies where we had applauded her triumphs. The more I reflected, the clearer my purpose became. This was not only about reclaiming dignity for myself. It was about exposing a mechanism that allowed abuse to masquerade as mentorship and leadership. I slept poorly that night, the mind restless with the precise choreography of truth. The next day would bring conversion from private certainty to public reckoning. Yet, even as adrenaline sharpened my senses, I remembered to breathe. Power collapses are rarely dramatic fireworks. They are methodical avalanches triggered by small, deliberate strokes. When dawn approached, I felt neither triumph nor malice, only a deep, businesslike clarity. The time to pull the threads together had come. The morning the truth began shifting out of the shadows carried an unusual stillness, as if the world itself sensed that the balance of power was preparing to tilt. For weeks, I had built the scaffolding of a reckoning with quiet precision. Now, the machinery of exposure had begun to hum beneath the surface, subtle but unstoppable. The final pieces were aligning, and the first crack in Ava's carefully curated crown was about to form. The regulatory contact I had approached, the one who had agreed to review the preliminary files, began by discreetly requesting official documents from 2 of Ava's subsidiaries. The request was not aggressive enough to cause panic, but firm enough to force compliance. These early inquiries often go unnoticed in large corporations. But in Ava's world, where control was oxygen, even a whisper of audit felt like a trespass. The moment that request reached her office, her instincts would sharpen. It was the first stitch in a tear that would widen if she pulled back too hard to fix it. While the regulator moved, the investigative journalist I had engaged began quietly interviewing individuals whose testimonies aligned with the dossier. He contacted the landscape architect, the former protégé, the retired consultant, and a few minor employees who had left without explanation. His approach was subtle. He asked for context, not accusations. He framed their stories as part of a broader industry pattern, rather than a direct expose. This reassured them enough to open up without fear of retaliation. Their accounts, once documented and cross-referenced, would paint a picture far more compelling than any single accusation could. It was during this phase that fear began to form in Ava's ecosystem, not as open alarm, but as a shift in behavior. Board members who previously displayed unshakable loyalty started asking more questions than they answered. Emails that once praised Ava's leadership now carried undertones of caution and hesitation. Meetings became shorter, more guarded. The slightest mention of regulatory compliance caused noticeable discomfort among her inner circle. In elite structures, loyalty fractures quietly long before it breaks publicly. At home, Ethan noticed the shift indirectly. He began returning from work with a tense energy, like someone holding information they hadn't yet processed. He mentioned boardroom restlessness, whispered speculations about internal reviews, and confusion about why Ava was suddenly more demanding, more easily agitated, more obsessive about controlling narratives. Her temper, once surgical and calculated, had grown brittle. She held emergency meetings at odd hours, monitored communications obsessively, and treated minor setbacks as personal attacks. When an empire feels threatened, the ruler begins to see enemies everywhere. My role, however, was not to agitate the enemy, it was to remain invisible while the walls shifted around her. I continued with mundane routines, a portrait of a calm and detached spouse. I attended occasional social gatherings, made polite conversation, and kept my distance from any talk that touched on the corporate storm I was orchestrating. Invisibility was my greatest armor. If Ava even suspected that I was the architect of her unraveling, she would attack not emotionally, but with the strategic cruelty of a woman accustomed to eliminating threats. I needed her to believe the threat was coming from forces she could not pinpoint or control. As the week progressed, the regulator sent a second request, this time broader. It included financial statements from a project Ava had repeatedly showcased as her most ethical success story. The project was marketed as a sustainability-driven residential development aimed at supporting underfunded communities. It had earned her awards, keynote invitations, and global recognition. Yet, hidden within the amendments of those documents lay evidence of diverted funds, underpaid contractors, and charity allocations that had circled back into her own subsidiaries. If unveiled, this single project could not only collapse her moral branding, but also raise questions about fraud. The board felt the tremor first. An emergency meeting was held, closed door and discreet. Ethan attended it reluctantly, torn between his career and the sinking feeling that the woman he once admired was not what she seemed. Inside that room, the board was briefed about the regulatory inquiry, not in detail, but enough to cause unease. A rumor circulated that someone on the inside had leaked concerns. Fingers pointed quietly. Ava reassured them with manufactured confidence, dismissing the inquiry as a routine check triggered by jealous competitors. She made promises of compliance, transparency, and swift resolution. She masked her anxiety well, but those who knew her could detect the tension tightening behind her polished expressions. Fear had entered her domain, not as chaos, but as a slow creeping awareness that her empire was no longer unchallenged. While Ava attempted containment, I accelerated exposure readiness. The journalist began drafting the framework of the story, one that would unfold not as a scandal piece, but as an expose of systemic abuse of power. He preferred a narrative that combined financial misconduct with the human toll of Ava's ambition. He wanted a piece that would resonate beyond corporate circles, one that would compel the public to question how female empowerment is often weaponized by those who preach it. If the story were positioned correctly, it would not merely shame Ava, it would strip her of the moral identity she had built her empire upon. Simultaneously, the forensic accountant uncovered a trail that could convert suspicion into undeniable evidence. A series of invoices reflected development expenses that did not match the materials used. Contractors had been paid for premium-grade supplies, yet cheaper products were installed. The cost difference had been routed to a consulting firm owned by a silent partner, one we traced back to an associate with direct ties to Ava. If this could be tied to her approval, the case would shift from unethical to criminal. Exposure was no longer a question of if, but when. During these developments, Ethan's internal conflict intensified. He began to observe Ava through a new lens, not as a mentor or visionary, but as someone desperately guarding a throne built on shifting sand. He asked me one night, with an uneasy voice, whether I believed that leadership could corrupt a person completely. I answered truthfully, but without revealing the extent of my involvement. Some leaders rise by lifting others, and some rise by climbing over them. The difference shows when their power is threatened. Ethan's silence afterward told me he recognized which category Ava belonged to. As the dossier neared completion, I arranged the final yet most delicate step: securing testimonies that could withstand legal scrutiny. Documents can be argued. Interpretations can be twisted. But if victims, employees, and former allies stood behind their accounts, the story would gain an unbreakable spine. 2 individuals agreed to go on record with their names, one of them being the former protégé. She said she would speak, not for revenge, but for closure. She wanted her story to mean something. She wanted others to see the warning she wished she had seen earlier. Her bravery added a moral anchor to the case. The other was a middle-aged project manager who had once been fiercely loyal to Ava, only to be discarded when he questioned her decisions. His testimony gave a rare perspective, the fall of a believer. He said he had defended Ava against criticism for years, believing her methods were necessary to break barriers. But there comes a moment when belief shatters under the weight of truth. He regretted staying silent as long as he had. His regret gave the story a human wound, proof that villains are often enabled by those who remain loyal too long. Now, the story had characters, evidence, timelines, financial trails, human consequences, and legal footing. It was not an attack, it was a case. All that remained was timing. The storm needed to hit when Ava was at her highest point, when the fall would be the loudest, the most undeniable, and the most irreversible. And fate, in a rare act of poetic synchronization, handed me the perfect opportunity. Ava was scheduled to receive an international award for ethical leadership in real estate in 3 weeks. The event would be broadcast, attended by global press, and celebrated by industry icons. She would stand on a stage, praised as a pioneer of integrity. That stage would become her undoing. To destroy a legacy, one must expose the truth on the very platform built to celebrate the lie. As I reviewed the complete dossier one final time, I felt no exhilaration, no triumphant thrill, only a steady certainty. Some storms roar, others seep quietly into the cracks, until the structure collapses under its own weight. Mine would be the latter. The first crack in Ava's crown had formed. Soon, the crown would fall publicly, permanently, and with the same silence she once mistook for weakness. The 3 weeks leading to the award ceremony unfolded with the kind of deceptive calm that precedes an earthquake. Everything on the surface of Ava's world appeared immaculate: press releases celebrating her achievements, social media campaigns praising her as a role model, rehearsals for her acceptance speech, and an unstoppable wave of admiration directed her way. But below that polished exterior, the threads I had pulled were tightening around her empire, like a net closing with invisible but unbreakable force. Preparation for her downfall required precision. A premature misstep could alert her, allowing her to pivot, silence witnesses, or manipulate the narrative into victimhood. I spent those weeks refining the release plan like a strategist architecting a siege. It needed 3 parallel strikes: legal, public, and institutional. Only if all 3 hit within hours of each other would the collapse be swift enough to prevent her from spinning a counter-narrative. The legal strike involved the regulator. They had collected enough preliminary evidence to justify a formal investigation, one that could no longer be kept confidential. However, the timing of that announcement would determine the magnitude of its impact. If it came before the ceremony, Ava could withdraw and contain the damage quietly. If it came after, she could claim the award itself as proof of her integrity. The regulator agreed off the record to initiate the investigation the morning after the ceremony, provided we supplied the final confirmatory documents at least 48 hours prior. The public strike belonged to the journalist. He had compiled a meticulous feature, not sensationalized but detailed and irrefutable. It was scheduled to release the moment the award ceremony ended, time-stamped to coincide with the peak of media attention on Ava. The first headline would not be an accusation. It would be a question. Questions are more dangerous than statements. They invite others to look, to inspect, to doubt. Doubt erodes reputations faster than scandal. The full expose, complete with testimonies and financial breakdowns, would release 12 hours later, once the initial tremor had unsettled the ground. The institutional strike was the most delicate. It involved the board. If the board turned on Ava, even momentarily, the collapse would become internal insurrection rather than external attack. I needed at least 2 board members to experience enough fear of association to distance themselves, not dramatically, but just enough to shift internal balance. A board divided is the beginning of dethronement. One carefully anonymous email containing selective documents, nothing explosive, just concerning enough, was sent to 2 of the most influence-driven members. These individuals cared more about their own image than loyalty to Ava. Fear would work faster on them than morality ever would. While these mechanisms moved quietly, I maintained the image of a supportive spouse preparing for a high-profile event. I attended dress fittings, reviewed seating arrangements, and participated in polite conversations about the ceremony. I smiled when necessary, expressed pride in Ethan's association with such a prestigious company, and carried myself with the kind of grace that attracts no suspicion. I knew that invisibility was still my most valuable asset. Ava could not fight what she could not see coming. Ethan's internal conflict deepened as the ceremony neared. He was caught between admiration and doubt, loyalty and clarity, career and conscience. I watched him unravel silently. He no longer spoke of Ava with the same awe. Instead, he referred to her actions with unease, as though seeing her through a lens he had not been allowed to use before. He still worked closely with her, still attended strategy meetings, but his belief in her infallibility had fractured. That fracture meant he would not shield her when the storm hit, not intentionally, but because his conviction was no longer strong enough to fight for a sinking cause. The night before the event, I ensured all systems were in place. Encrypted files sent to the regulator. The journalist's article scheduled. The board's anonymous tip delivered. Witnesses on standby. Legal counsel ready for the inevitable counter-accusations. Everything sat in silent readiness, like chess pieces positioned for a final checkmate move. The morning of the ceremony arrived with crisp skies and a golden sun, ironic for a day that would end in darkness for one woman. The venue was grand, designed like a cathedral of wealth. Tall arched ceilings, gold-embellished decor, cameras stationed in strategic angles, luxury cars lining the entrance, and a red carpet rolled out for the industry's most influential. Attendees were confident like couture. Everyone wanted to be seen, photographed, associated with greatness. Ava arrived with the poise of a queen ascending her throne. Cameras flashed, journalists called her name. Guests applauded, and she accepted their admiration with her usual crafted humility. She spoke to young entrepreneurs on the carpet about empowerment, resilience, and ethical leadership, words that would rot in her mouth once the truth emerged. Hypocrisy wears the most beautiful dress before it burns. Inside the hall, guests took their seats around circular tables, elegantly set for the prestigious evening. Ethan and I sat near the front, positioned as part of the inner circle. He adjusted his tie with trembling hands, aware that the woman he had once idolized would soon face a reckoning that might destroy everything he built his career on. I did not comfort him. Growth sometimes demands discomfort. As the ceremony progressed, speeches echoed across the room, praise after praise, story after story painting Ava as a trailblazer. She absorbed it all with grace, her smile a weapon polished through years of pretending sincerity. When her name was finally announced as the recipient of the award, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. She walked up to the stage bathed in admiration, her gown flowing behind her like a royal train. She accepted the award, posed for photographs, and then began her acceptance speech. It was a speech crafted to perfection. She spoke of her journey, the obstacles she faced as a woman in a male-dominated field, the sacrifices she made, the values that guided her, and the legacy she hoped to leave for future generations. She ended with a statement about integrity being the cornerstone of leadership, words that would return to devour her within hours. When the ceremony concluded, the applause thundered, cameras flashed, interviews lined up. Media rushed to publish glowing headlines about her triumph. For a brief moment, the world believed Ava had ascended to a new height. That moment was essential. Because the higher she stood, the further she would fall. Later that evening, as the after-party unfolded with champagne and celebratory toasts, a quiet notification hit the inboxes of regulators and selected journalists. An official notice of investigation into financial irregularities at Ava's company. Phones buzzed. Conversations shifted. Confusion began to ripple, subtle but perceptible. People glanced at their screens, their celebratory expressions dimming as they whispered to the person beside them. Within an hour of the ceremony ending, the first headline appeared, not the expose. Just the question, is the real estate icon too good to be true? It was enough. Doubt had entered the room like a cold draft. Guests began leaving earlier than planned. Board members exchanged tense looks. Ava's PR team clustered in corners with anxious, hushed conversations. Ava herself maintained composure, but her eyes narrowed, her pulse visible at her neck. She sensed the shift. It was slight, but unmistakable. The energy around her had changed. The article, the real article, would drop in the early hours of the morning, when silence amplifies impact and when news spreads globally before dawn allows her to react. As the night ended and we returned home, the world still believed in Ava's crown, but the first crack was widening. The stage had been built for her glory. By sunrise, that same stage would become the first platform of her fall. The fall of a legacy rarely begins with noise, it begins with a shift in perception. And that shift started in the darkest hours of the night, when the world was asleep and truth moved freely, unchallenged, across screens and whispers. At 3:12 a.m., the investigative article went live. Unlike gossip or scandal-driven tabloid writing, it was a meticulously constructed expose, calm, thorough, and unhurried in its destruction. It opened not with accusation, but with contrast. The award Ava had accepted hours earlier, held up against the first breadcrumb of doubt. The journalist did not claim corruption. He illuminated it. He did not attack Ava's achievements. He questioned the price others had paid for them. It was the kind of writing that made readers feel they were discovering the truth themselves, page by page. The article detailed the financial discrepancies, the questionable invoices, the shell companies, and the testimonies of those who had been silenced, manipulated, or discarded. It named sources willing to stand behind their words. It offered documents. It offered patterns. It offered enough to turn pride into suspicion and admiration into scrutiny. Within the first hour, the article crossed thousands of shares, even without sensational promotion. Industry insiders circulated it in private group chats. Employees whispered it across confidential threads. And by dawn, news outlets were picking it up, referencing it as a developing story that demands immediate attention. But by the time the sun rose, this was no longer a developing story, it had become a storm. Board members awakened to dozens of missed calls. Investors found emails from journalists requesting statements. Staff saw the company's name trending online for reasons no amount of PR could spin as positive. Silence spread through Ava's corporate headquarters, not the silence of routine, but of shock. A second blow arrived late morning. The regulatory body made its investigation public. A short formal announcement appeared on its site indicating that Ava's company was under review for potential financial and ethical misconduct relating to recent development projects. It provided no details, no accusations, just confirmation of inquiry. But that alone was a dagger to any public trust her empire relied on. If perception had shifted at 3 a.m., certainty began forming by 11 a.m. Ava's PR team released a statement calling the allegations unfounded, sensationalized, and coordinated by jealous competitors. But the language lacked the conviction of innocence. It sounded defensive, shaken, improvised, not the polished tone of someone in control. Her social media accounts limited comments. Posts were quietly deleted. She canceled scheduled interviews that were meant to celebrate her award. Inside the company, panic spread like smoke through air vents. Meetings were called with no agenda, employees sat clutching phones, and senior executives appeared visibly alarmed. Not because they believed Ava was guilty, many already suspected pieces of the truth, but because they feared being associated with the fallout. People do not abandon a leader because the leader falls, they abandon the leader because they don't want to fall with them. In the early afternoon, the first visible fracture appeared. One of the board members who received the anonymous email requested an emergency board meeting without Ava present. That request alone marked a historic shift. No one in the company's history had dared suggest making decisions without her. The board did not remove her, not yet, but the request was enough to signify the changing tide. While the world around Ava spun into chaos, I kept my routine as if nothing unusual had occurred. Stillness protected my anonymity. My tea was brewed at the usual time, I responded to non-essential emails, and I attended a planned afternoon charity event with quiet grace. The calm for me was not forced, it was earned. Revenge did not thrill me. It steadied me. That evening, Ethan returned home in a state of silent shock. His face carried the exhaustion of a man watching the collapse of a structure he once believed unshakable. He sat down heavily, his voice fragile. He spoke of confusion in the office, of whispered accusations, of staff fearful for their jobs, of Ava lashing out behind closed doors and demanding loyalty. She had called him personally, her voice trembling between fury and desperation, insisting he reassure her that he believed the accusations were lies. He had not answered her the way she expected. Doubt had taken root in him, and doubt is the first step of disobedience. He did not ask me if I was involved. Perhaps he suspected. Perhaps he feared the answer. Perhaps a part of him already knew the truth and could not bring himself to confront it. But he did ask something else, something heavy with vulnerability. What do you think happens to someone who builds everything on a lie? I answered calmly. Eventually the lie collects its debt. Overnight, testimonies from former employees began surfacing anonymously online. A few were hesitant, but the article gave them courage. One confession leads to another. Silence breaks in waves, not raindrops. Stories emerged about toxic leadership, workplace manipulation, and projects where corners had been cut at the expense of safety. Nothing yet legally destructive, but reputationally devastating. By the next morning, media outlets who had once glorified Ava requested her comment for damage control segments. Headlines became sharper. Award-winning CEO under fire. From role model to question leader overnight. Inside the allegations shaking the real estate icon. The fall had begun, not yet catastrophic but undeniable. As I read through the news that morning, I realized something important. I no longer felt anger nor satisfaction, only closure. The woman who once stood in my home at 2 a.m., claiming ownership over my husband with a silence sharper than any confession, now stood on a cliff edge of her own making. And she was beginning to sense the ground beneath her shifting. But there was one more truth I needed to confront, one I had postponed while building Ava's downfall, my marriage. Ethan and I sat in the same house, but we were no longer living the same life. He was a man unraveling, torn between the illusion he had worshipped and the truth he was now forced to face. The silence between us was no longer strategic, it had become a mirror of distance. I did not hate him. I simply no longer waited for him. But the collapse of Ava alone was not the end of my story. There were consequences to navigate professionally, socially, and personally. A storm may be designed, but one must still stand firm in it when the winds come. And they were coming. Because the empire was trembling, but it had not yet collapsed. The next events would not be about headlines, reputation, or inquiry. They would be about survival. The days following the public eruption were defined by a tension that spread through the city's elite like a silent contagion. Ava's name, once spoken with admiration, had become a subject handled with caution. Conversations paused when she entered a room. Invitations she would have received without question were suddenly being reviewed. Influence, her greatest weapon, was slipping from her grasp. But powerful people do not fall gracefully. They fight not for truth, but for control. Ava began to fight. Her first instinct was not to address the allegations, but to identify the source. She demanded loyalty statements from her executives, pushed her legal team to trace leaks, and ordered a sweep of internal communications. She treated suspicion like rope, tightening it around everyone's throat to see who would choke first. She was not searching for innocence, she was hunting for betrayal. The company's internal tone shifted sharply. A culture once built on admiration had turned into one of surveillance. Employees deleted messages, avoided speaking in hallways, and refused to be seen with anyone outside their departments. Security teams interviewed staff under the guise of routine protocol. It was not protocol, it was intimidation disguised as procedure. Ava's board, however, had begun distancing themselves. 2 members privately advised the others to freeze any major financial decisions. Another requested independent legal counsel. Ava sensed the revolt, and like any ruler losing authority, she sought to reclaim power through fear. Behind closed doors, she confronted her senior executives individually. It was said she alternated between promises of protection and threats of ruin. Some left those meetings pale, others defensive, and a few left with trembling hands knowing the woman they had once revered now saw them as expendable obstacles in her path to survival. Meanwhile, the regulator accelerated the inquiry. Requests became demands. Interviews were scheduled with mid-level managers who had once signed off on the questionable projects. Silence was no longer an option for them. Legal consequences outweigh loyalty to Ava. Truth, when forced, spreads faster than lies. The journalist's second article dropped, this time deeper, sharper, and more direct. It named specific projects, provided excerpts from testimonies, and published select documents showing financial misdirection. It highlighted Ava's strategic use of mentorship to control rising talent, portraying it not as empowerment, but as grooming people for dependency. It framed her success as built on silencing others, not elevating them. The impact was brutal. Media outlets that once praised her now dissected her leadership style. Former admirers retreated. Her social media pages turned into battlegrounds. Comment sections overflowed not with insults, but with disappointment. Disappointment wounds deeper than hatred because it erases respect. Her carefully crafted image of a woman who broke ceilings for others to rise now stood exposed as a ceiling she reinforced to ensure only she remained above it. When a queen's myth collapses, her kingdom loses faith. But while Ava fought her external war, I began preparing for the personal one that would reach my doorstep. Ava was a strategist. Once she realized the leak was not external sabotage, she would look closer toward those she underestimated. Toward the ones she thought too weak, too silent, too irrelevant to pose a threat. Toward me. I made myself appear removed from the chaos, a wife observing events with confusion rather than involvement. I attended social events in neutral tones, neither defending nor condemning Ava. Neutrality in chaos is a disguise more powerful than loyalty. It allowed me to gather reactions without drawing attention. Behind that neutrality, I took the final step of preparation. I safeguarded Ethan, not because I wanted to save him, but because I would not allow him to become collateral damage in a war he was unprepared to survive. I met with a lawyer to ensure Ethan's role in the company was legally protected from potential scapegoating. If Ava became desperate enough, she would sacrifice anyone necessary to preserve herself. Ethan, once favored, would make a convenient shield for her. I would not allow that. Despite everything, I did not intend to destroy him, only the part of him she controlled. Within our home, silence expanded into distance. Ethan became more withdrawn, burdened by guilt and clarity intertwined. He watched the news with haunted eyes, seeing his career, his identity at risk. He no longer spoke of Ava with admiration. He spoke of her as a downfall he had not foreseen. He was not yet ready to admit his betrayal aloud, but awareness of it lingered in every look he gave me. I had forgiven nothing, but I had released the expectation of remorse. Some apologies, when delayed too long, lose their worth. 2 weeks into the controversy, Ava made her first public appearance since the allegations. She hosted a press conference and attempted to seize back control. She walked into the room confident, poised, ready to manipulate perception. She denied every accusation, dismissed the testimonies as embittered fabrications, accused media of misogyny, and claimed she was being targeted for being a successful woman in a male-dominated field. She weaponized feminism as a shield. Her performance was compelling enough to sway a few, confuse some, and relieve those who desperately wanted to believe her, but it did not erase doubt. In fact, it fueled the investigation. Regulators do not close cases because someone appears confident on camera. Still, I watched her speech carefully. Her eyes held a sharpness, not of a woman defeated, but of one narrowing in on prey. She had sensed the trap. And she would look for the person who built it. 2 days later, I received the first sign that she was turning her gaze toward me. My phone rang from an unknown number. The voice on the other end did not introduce herself. She simply said, with a calmness that carried warning, "Ava knows someone close betrayed her. She is going to start asking the right questions." I did not respond. Silence was safer. The caller continued, "She will not go down quietly. Be ready." And just as quietly she hung up. I recognized the voice. It was the former protégé, the woman who had given testimony. It wasn't fear in her tone, it was caution. That night, for the first time since the beginning of my plan, I felt the cold edge of danger, not fear for my safety, but anticipation of the confrontation I knew would eventually come. Ava was losing control of her empire. And when a ruler begins to lose her kingdom, she stops looking at her enemies, she looks at her inner circle. And I had positioned myself exactly where she would least expect the real threat to be. The downfall of a powerful person is never a straight descent. It comes in phases: denial, retaliation, desperation, and collapse. Ava had passed denial. She was entering retaliation, and retaliation from someone who had spent her entire life winning was never gentle. The first strike landed quietly. Ethan received a formal notice from the company's legal department requiring him to attend a confidential compliance inquiry. The phrasing was deliberately vague, a tactic to instill fear without clarity. Many received similar notices, but Ethan's was marked as urgent. It was Ava's way of tightening the noose around those closest to her, probing for cracks, forcing panic that might reveal disloyalty. Ethan looked at the letter for a long time before speaking, as if the paper itself carried the weight of his undoing. He confessed that Ava had questioned him privately, pressing him to disclose whether he had spoken to journalists or regulators. She had reminded him of everything she had done for his career, implying that betrayal would have consequences. When he couldn't provide the blind loyalty she demanded, she ended the conversation with a calm, chilling statement that she always finds the root of contamination. Her choice of words confirmed my expectation. She was hunting not for truth, but for a scapegoat. The inquiry was scheduled for 2 days later. I knew this was her testing for weakness, searching for the thread to pull that might lead her to whoever was orchestrating her downfall. Ethan was vulnerable. Fear had weakened his defenses. If she cornered him, he could reveal something unintentionally that connected back to me. I needed to steady him not for the marriage, but for the protection of the plan. That night, for the first time in months, I sat beside him. I did not speak of forgiveness or betrayal. I spoke only of truth and resilience. I reminded him that honesty did not require confession, only clarity. If he had not leaked information, then there was nothing to confess. His fear was rooted not in guilt, but in the crumbling identity Ava had once built around him. He had to detach from her psychologically before she destroyed him. He listened, quietly. He didn't ask how I knew what to say. He was beginning to understand that my silence had never been ignorance. It had been endurance. But I could not rely on Ethan alone to survive Ava's interrogation. I put a protective measure in place, a legal observer who would attend the inquiry under the guise of support for employee rights. It will limit Ava's ability to coerce or manipulate the questioning. The second strike came less quietly. 2 days later, as Ethan sat in the inquiry room, an external news outlet released a third report, not an investigation this time, but an expose on Ava's pattern of professional mentorship possession. It highlighted her habit of isolating protégés from peers, controlling their career decisions, and involving herself personally in their lives to the point of emotional dependency. It referenced 3 unnamed individuals who had undergone this pattern, each story disturbingly similar. Those familiar with the industry began connecting dots. Social media erupted with the term, the Kingsley grooming method, a phrase that would haunt her reputation permanently. This was the article I had known would hit Ava hardest, not because it attacked her business, but because it pierced her self-invented identity as a savior of women. It questioned her narrative, the one she valued far above profit or power. Money she could fight over. Image she could battle with PR. But the exposure of her psychological manipulation, the thing she secretly prided herself on, cut her deeper than any financial scandal could. It made the industry re-evaluate every relationship she had ever built. It made her empowerment speeches look predatory. It made her feminism look performative and weaponized. She could deny numbers. She could not deny patterns seen in people's lives. By evening, she was no longer trending as a fallen hero. She was trending as a fraud. That night, she made her move. It was past 10 p.m. when my phone rang. The screen displayed her name. Ava Kingsley. For a moment, the house felt suspended in stillness. Ethan glanced at the phone, fear flickering across his face. I let it ring twice before answering, not out of hesitation, but control. She needed to know I wasn't rattled. Her voice, when it came, sounded nothing like the composed queen the world once admired. It was low, tightly restrained, forced into civility the same way one restrains anger so it won't spill into screaming. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't offer courtesy. She only said she heard that I had been meeting certain people from her past. She accused without naming the crime. She implied without presenting the proof. It was a test to see if I would crack, react, or defend. I did none of the 3. Silence unnerves a manipulator more than confrontation. When she spoke again, her voice carried a threat wrapped in velvet. That the world was full of women who tried to destroy other women out of jealousy, and that those women never ended well. For the first time since her empire began shaking, I felt her anger directed at me, not the wife of Ethan, not a background figure at corporate dinners, but as the woman she now suspected of orchestrating her downfall. But anger was not her weapon. Her weapon was control, and she had just lost it. I ended the call politely, calmly, with no cracks for her to hold on to. After the call, I realized something essential. Ava wasn't dangerous because she was powerful. She was dangerous because she believed she was invincible. A belief that was now crumbling. The third strike of the night came unexpectedly, not from Ava, but from an unlikely ally. The former protégé messaged me, a single sentence. She knows it's you. Prepare for the last battle. There was no fear in her warning, only inevitability. Ava had finally sensed the architect of her undoing. She would come for me, not through lawsuits or public attempts, but the way she always handled threats. Privately, surgically, through psychological warfare. But she had underestimated one last thing. I had built this war not to destroy her career, not to steal her power, not even to avenge myself, but to end the legacy of a predator who had thrived in the name of empowerment. Her empire was bleeding. But Chapter 9 would be the part where she tried to strike back, and where I would end the game entirely. Retaliation from a cornered predator is rarely subtle. It is frantic, instinctive, and self-destructive. And Ava, for the first time in her life, was cornered. She moved quickly, as if speed could compensate for the shrinking territory beneath her feet. The morning after our call, she launched what she believed would be her counterattack, one designed to break me psychologically before she attempted to reclaim her public image. But she did not understand something fundamental. You cannot break what no longer fears you. Her first tactic was social isolation. Influential women in our social circle, those who once followed her like disciples, began reaching out with forced sympathy, dripping with insincere concern. They asked questions framed like support, but constructed to extract information. You must be devastated by what the media is doing to Ava. She always spoke so highly of you and Ethan. Are you doing okay? Rumors say someone close started all this, surely not you. Their words were bait. Their calls were surveillance. Ava was using them as her messengers, hoping one of them would trigger a confession or an emotional slip she could exploit. I gave them nothing, no anger, no comfort, only calm neutrality. When social manipulation failed, Ava pivoted to intimidation. A confidential letter arrived not to me directly, but delivered to the board, where she expected it would intimidate Ethan and through him reach me. In the letter, Ava accused unnamed internal forces of conspiring to destroy the company and frame her. She demanded a full internal investigation into all employee communications with journalists and regulators. It was the last attempt at casting herself as a victim of a witch hunt. The board responded in a way she had not anticipated. They agreed to the investigation, but under an independent external auditor, not under Ava's supervision. It was a subtle shift in power, one that took away her control of the narrative internally. By agreeing to investigate but removing her authority over the process, the board communicated a silent truth. They no longer trusted her. The more Ava tried to tighten her grip, the more she exposed her desperation. Her next move was personal. Late one night, our gate security reported that Ava had arrived at the estate unannounced. She requested to speak with Ethan privately. He refused to let her in. It was the first boundary he had drawn against her, the first act of loyalty he had shown to himself rather than to her. That refusal enraged her. She sat in her car outside for nearly 20 minutes before driving away, her dignity leaking as visibly as her empire. By then, her downfall was no longer just public, it was psychological. But the real collapse began when the regulator released the first official findings. They discovered discrepancies large enough to justify a full forensic audit of all her property developments over the last 7 years. The announcement went public. Markets reacted. Investors withdrew. One partnership suspended contracts with her company pending investigation. Another released a statement distancing themselves entirely. Then came the first lawsuit filed by a group of residents from one of her sustainable community projects, citing structural defects and misrepresentation. Once legal action begins, it spreads like contagion. More followed, and with each lawsuit, more victims found their courage. Ava tried to respond, but her responses contradicted one another. First, she said she knew nothing. Then she claimed she approved everything. Then she blamed former employees. Then she called allegations fabricated. The inconsistency revealed what she had spent years hiding. Behind her leadership facade was chaos. Public perception flipped. Articles shifted tone from investigative questioning to full exposure. Influencers who once quoted her now condemned her. Female leaders who once praised her publicly now spoke about the danger of performative empowerment. Ava had become a case study in everything she pretended to stand against. Her empire was not falling because of me. It was falling because, once exposed, it had nothing solid beneath it. As the world watched her unravel, I focused on securing closure, not vengeance. There was one final loose thread, the emotional tether she still believed existed between her and Ethan. She still assumed he was her last loyal soldier, someone she could weaponize if cornered. She did not understand that he had already crossed the internal bridge of disillusionment. He was not healed, but he was no longer hers. I chose this moment, not out of cruelty but necessity, to close the chapter on our marriage, not with anger, but with truth. One evening, I sat across from Ethan in the living room, the same space where, months earlier, I had first seen the shadow of betrayal in his eyes. But this time, the silence between us was not distance, it was understanding. I told him the truth, not every detail of my involvement, not the names, not the strategy, but enough for him to understand that Ava's fall had not been accidental. It had been necessary. I told him that I had stayed silent not because I was weak, but because I needed to build something stronger than confrontation, accountability. He did not defend his past. He did not justify his choices. He listened like a man finally seeing the full painting after staring at a single brushstroke for too long. He apologized not with words seeking forgiveness, but with acceptance of accountability. We did not decide the future of our marriage that night. We only acknowledged that the marriage we once had was already gone. Whatever came next would not be about Avi, it would be about us, separate from her shadow. 2 days later, the board issued an official statement. Ava Kingsley was suspended as CEO pending the outcome of investigations. The statement was short, sterile, and devastating. Ava responded the way all fallen rulers do, by trying to reclaim the throne in one last tragic act of denial. She called an all-staff live-stream meeting, unsanctioned by the board, trying to rally employees to her side. Her voice cracked. Her arguments contradicted. She pleaded, then threatened, then tried to evoke loyalty. But the comments section told a different story, one of disillusionment, disappointment, and anger from those she had used. The live stream ended abruptly. Because halfway through, the board cut her access. In one click, her reign ended. She had collapsed by her own hand. The next morning, paparazzi captured her leaving her penthouse, mascara streaked, hair unpolished, shielding her face not from camera flashes, but from reality. Her empire, her image, her power gone. But there was still one final chapter to close. Because Ava's legacy had ended, but mine hadn't begun yet. Chapter 10 would not be about her. It would be about what rises after the ashes of someone else's fire. The fall of Ava Kingsley did not echo, it thundered. It rippled through industries, echoed in boardrooms, and rewrote how people spoke about leadership, power, and influence. Her name, once used as inspiration, became a cautionary tale. Her empire fractured, lawsuits multiplied, and her image dissolved under the weight of her own lies. But my story did not end with her. It began after her. The first morning after her removal, I woke to a quiet house, a house that had once felt like a theater of betrayal, now washed clean of the shadows that haunted it. Sunlight filtered through the windows, not as a reminder of another performance to uphold, but as an invitation to breathe freely. Freedom, I learned, does not announce itself with celebration. It arrives in silence, in the space where fear once lived. Ethan sat at the dining table, staring at a blank cup of coffee he had not touched. His suit jacket hung over the chair, not as armor for the day ahead, but as a weight he no longer wished to carry. For the first time since this began, he was not trying to appear composed. He looked human, vulnerable, aware. The collapse of Ava had dismantled the illusion he had lived under. He wasn't the same man who had stood by her side at corporate events, intoxicated by the glow of borrowed power. He had seen the destruction she left behind, not just in her company, but in the people who trusted her and in himself. The guilt of his part in it lingered, not as punishment, but as transformation. He spoke softly, acknowledging his betrayal not only of our marriage, but of himself. He asked what came next for us. Not with expectation, but with respect for whatever answer I chose. For months I had lived in silent war. My identity had been sharpened by strategy, clarity, and resolve. Now, I needed to decide who I wanted to be after the battle, because winning a war is not the same as building a life. I did not want our story to be defined by the woman who tried to claim him. If we rebuilt, it would be because we chose each other, not because he had lost her. So I asked for something he never offered before: space. Not distance, not escape, space to rediscover myself outside of the war I had been fighting. He agreed, not out of fear, but out of understanding. He moved to a smaller apartment near his new job, far from the corporate heights he once chased, but grounded, honest, and his own. It was his first act of building a life unshaped by another's shadow. I stayed in the house, not because it symbolized victory, but because it no longer symbolized pain. I transformed it. I cleared out rooms that stored memories that did not serve me. I replaced the cold marble aesthetic Ava once admired with warmth, art, and life. I hosted small gatherings with women, real women who had stories, strength, and ambition without the need for validation through power. In time, one idea grew into purpose. Throughout Ava's collapse, I had seen a truth. There were countless women in industries, careers, and homes who were manipulated under the guise of mentorship, empowerment, or guidance, not just by female leaders like Ava, but by anyone who used authority as emotional leverage. I began meeting some of the women who came forward privately at first, then openly. We spoke not about Ava, but about recovery, identity, and reclaiming one's narrative after being controlled. Those conversations birthed a vision far greater than revenge. I launched a foundation not against Ava, not against any individual, but against the culture that allowed people like her to thrive. A foundation dedicated to helping women rebuild careers after harmful mentorships, workplace manipulation, or psychological control disguised as professional growth. We provided legal support, career redirection, therapy access, and networks to reconnect them with genuine mentors. Ironically, the funding that began the foundation came from a settlement offered by Ava's company to avoid one of the lawsuits going to trial. I redirected the damage she caused into the healing of others. It became the legacy I chose for myself, not the woman who destroyed someone powerful, but the woman who empowered those once silenced. Months later, when the dust around Ava finally settled, I received an email, no threats, no denial, no defiance. Just a single sentence. I never thought you were capable of winning. It was the closest Ava could come to acknowledging defeat. I did not respond, because I had not fought to win. I had fought to end the reign that hurt others. A year later, Ava's company was dissolved. Her properties sold, her board replaced. She lived outside the city, away from the world that once worshipped her. Not ruined, but irrelevant, the one fate a woman like her could never bear. As for Ethan and I, time did what confrontation could not. It softened the edges, allowed us to see each other beyond roles we once played in a war neither of us asked for. We rebuilt slowly, not as a return to the past, but as new people learning one another again. Forgiveness was not a gift. It was a decision made after healing, not before. Our story did not end with a dramatic reunion. It grew, quietly, gently, honestly. One evening, long after the storm, I stood in the garden that had once been nothing more than lawn decor for corporate dinners. Now it was a space with flowers, life, color. Mine. I watched the sunset not as symbolism but as closure. I realized something profound. Revenge had never been my victory. My victory was that I didn't become her. I walked away not with her crown, but with my own voice. Ava's legacy ended with scandal, mine began with truth. And the night she once said, "He's mine," became the night I took back my life, not by taking him away from her, but by taking myself away from the version of me that ever thought she could own anything I built. Because nothing worth having is owned. It is chosen. And I finally chose myself.